Last week, we talked about the beginning of God's story, when God created the entire world through his love, and then human selfishness showed up and ruined it all. Sin turned what was very good into something corrupt. And the things that were perfect in the garden now are broken versions of themselves. But God promised humanity that he would take care of this sin problem and make everything right. And today we get the first chapter of what God is going to do about sin. See, instead of making human selfishness our problem to overcome, God decided that he was going to take steps to alleviate human selfishness. Because that's not a small job or anything, to try to make humans less selfish. That's not a small job at all. So what does he do? Well, he starts giving the people covenants. Now you might be thinking, because I was thinking this, why didn't Jesus just come earlier? I mean, why do this whole covenant thing at all if Jesus is going to show up and fix the problem? And I think the answer is that we weren't ready yet. We as humans weren't yet ready for Jesus to show up. So God had to do something first as kind of a first step to get us more ready for Jesus to show up. And that first step becomes known as the law. But the law is not the only covenant that we have in the Old Testament. There's actually several of them. Now, what is a covenant? I had to look this one up because I was kind of confused. I always just thought a covenant was a promise. God promises something, and that's a covenant. And it turns out that I was sort of right. Did you know that a covenant is actually a legal term? It's one of those things that, a covenant is a very carefully defined thing, even still today. And usually, oddly enough, today it usually refers to land deals. There's covenants involving deeds and land, and it's all very confusing and awkward unless you're a real estate attorney. But this is still a thing, these covenants that still exist. And a covenant is essentially a contract where one party says to another, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what you're going to do. And there's usually some manner of power imbalance in a covenant. There's usually the party that is in charge of the covenant and the party that is having the covenant put upon them. That's just kind of how this works. And we can see this in the Bible. There's people who study covenants, and that's the thing that they study in the Bible. But in general, think of it as God is making a contract with someone when he makes a covenant with them. And there's a lot of different kinds of them, but we have some good examples. So the first covenant that we really see is the covenant that God makes with Noah after the flood. Because God says to Noah, I will never again destroy the earth with a flood. Now that's a very one-sided covenant. That is God just making a contract with Noah saying, I'm never going to do that again. Noah doesn't have to do anything. He's not responsible for making sure God keeps his end of the deal. No, God's just saying, this is what I'm going to do. And that's the covenant. The next covenant we see, the next major one, is with Abraham, where God declares that Abraham's descendants will be a great nation living in a land to the east of Egypt, and the whole land will belong to his descendants. This is another very one-sided covenant. God says, Abraham, this is what's going to happen. God is promising and making this contract with Abraham that this is going to happen. And then we get the big one. Now, the big one's a little different, because this covenant that comes to be known as the law, which I have a really hard time saying without using Sylvester Stallone's terrible accent in the Judge Dredd movies, where he just says, I am... And you don't really know what he's saying, and you have to watch it with subtitles to figure out he said, oh, I am the law. Judge Dredd is a terrible movie, but I really enjoy it. I like terrible movies, what can I say? But So the law is what God is giving to the people of Israel. But this time, God's not just saying, I'm going to do this. This is a two-way covenant. Because God says to the people, I did this for you. I brought you out of Egypt. And this is what you do in response. Because that's what the law has always been. The law has always been a response. If you look at if you've ever been really stubborn and decided to read Leviticus, a lot of those laws go something like, do this thing, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Do this thing, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Because the reason for the law is always God brought the people out of Egypt. He saved them from slavery in Egypt. And so, this is how the covenant works. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Therefore, don't worship any other gods. Don't have any false idols. Don't swear falsely on my name. Honor your father and mother. You get the gist of where I'm going with this, right? It's all because God brought them out of Egypt. And so the intent is for humans to respond. Humans then, out of thanksgiving for what God has done, live out the law. Because if you live out the law, it means you will start loving your neighbor as you love yourself. Because that's how the law is built. Jesus even says the law is built around these two commandments. Love the Lord your God with everything that you are, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you live the law, you will be loving your neighbor. Now, there's a couple other covenants that happen. There's a covenant with Aaron and Phineas where God says, you guys are going to be priests. There's a covenant with David where God says that David's descendant will be a king forever. But the law is very much the big one. So why isn't the law good enough? Why doesn't the law take care of the problem of sin? I mean, if you follow the law, then human selfishness is put in check, but if you're at all familiar with, human nature in general, or the New Testament in specific, you start to see that people manipulate the law to their own ends. I mean, if people manipulate human law to get something the way they want it, of course they're going to manipulate God's law because that's what we do. Human selfishness hasn't been dealt with yet, it's just been mitigated. And it didn't take long, if you read the Old Testament, for people to pretty much take the law, throw it on the ground, stomp on it, mash their foot around it, have a dog go to the bathroom on it, and then stomp on it some more. Because the law is given in Deuteronomy, things are okay in Joshua, but by Judges, everything's a mess in Judges. There's a whole big passage just that's devoted to how big of a mess everything got in the book of Judges. And it culminates in saying, everyone did what they thought was right because there was no king in Israel. They just did their own thing, looking out for themselves and not caring about anything else. Because that's what we humans do. If we see a law, we're going to figure out a way around it. Oh, the speed limit's 55, but I can go 60. It's fine. They'll spot me 5. I can see by the smiles that many of us do that one. But you see what I mean? If there's a thing that says, can you do this? And you can do this, but you can't do that. How much of that can I actually do? Because really, let's be honest, that's what we did in the garden, right? Did God really say, you won't really die? Because that's what we do. So God had to try something different, but he had to get us ready for that something different to happen. God had to wait for just the right time for us to be ready for the new thing he's going to do that's going to flip everything over. Because the law is good, but it doesn't quite deal with sin. And one of the reasons it doesn't quite deal with sin is because it doesn't change the human heart. It just changes how we live. See, nothing in the law has any kind of promise about God making humans any different. It just says, live in these guidelines and things will go okay. Don't kill anybody. Don't steal stuff. Don't cheat on your spouse. Don't be jealous of your neighbor's stuff to the point that it causes problems. Those are all fine, but all it really does is mitigate human action. It gets in the way a little bit, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. Because humans are really bad at following laws. And even when we do, it's mostly because we're selfish, right? How many of you stop at stop signs? I would hope everyone. How many of you assume that the other person's going to stop at a stop sign? I mean, we all drive, but generally, it's kind of just a trust thing that we say, oh, this other person's going to stop if I stop. We're cautious, but because we always know that there's going to be somebody who thinks they're more important than everyone else, who's not going to listen to that. A stop sign can help, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. And that's what the law does. It helps. It builds structures that try to make sin less of a problem. But there's only one thing that's going to actually fix the problem of sin. Or should I say there's only one who is going to fix the problem of sin. Because while the law is good, while the law does help us, it doesn't do quite enough. And so when the time was right, God sends someone to fulfill that covenant, to fulfill the law, to live the law perfectly, and then start something new, start something different, yet also kind of the same. Only this new time, it's different enough because it's God. We have a promise that even though the covenant doesn't quite cover everything it needs to, someone will. And we won't just be rescued from slavery in Egypt anymore. We will be rescued from slavery to the very thing that has caused creation all of this problem: sin itself.